People think society survives because humans chose to be good, because somewhere along the way, people decided that hurting each other was wrong, because morality became the invisible glue holding civilization together. That is what most people believe. That is what most people were taught. But Thomas Hobbes looked at the same world and saw something completely different. He saw fear, not virtue, not conscience, not the goodness of the human heart. He saw a species that cooperates not because it wants to, but because it has no other safe option. And that distinction changes everything you think you understand about civilization. Most people never examine the foundation beneath their feet. They assume the floor is solid because nobody has fallen through it yet. Hobbes refused that comfort. He went underneath. And what he found down there was not reassuring. Before governments existed, before courts and prisons and social contracts, human beings lived in what Hobbes called the state of nature. No authority above anyone, no law with teeth, no system to punish betrayal, just raw human beings trying to survive in the same limited space with the same limited resources. Picture that world for a moment. No police officer arriving after the call, no judge weighing evidence, no prison waiting at the end of a trial, just you and the person who wants what you have. Hobbes described that world with 3 words that most people have heard but never truly absorbed: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He was not writing poetry. He was describing what humans actually become when the pressure of consequences disappears. And here is where the discomfort begins, because Hobbes was not describing ancient savages. He was describing the same creature that sits in traffic, pays taxes, holds doors open for strangers, and tells itself that it is fundamentally decent. The same creature, just without the system watching. People imagine morality as something internal, something woven into the human soul from birth, a compass that works even in the dark, even when no one is looking, even when nothing is at stake. But Hobbes challenged that image directly. He asked a question that most philosophy courses rush past. What if the moral behavior you observe in people is not a reflection of their character, but a reflection of their circumstances? What if the kindness is not free but rented? Rented from fear, fear of what people will think, fear of what systems will do, fear of what life becomes without the cooperation of others. That question is not comfortable because it does not stay outside. It comes inside. It points at you. Think about the last time you followed a rule you privately disagreed with. Did you follow it because your conscience demanded it? Or did you follow it because the cost of breaking it was simply too high? Be honest with yourself inside this moment, because Hobbes was not asking about humanity in the abstract. He was asking about you specifically. The state of nature was never a historical phase that civilization escaped permanently. It is a condition that emerges any time the pressure holding behavior in place is removed. Every natural disaster that triggers looting, every blackout that reveals what neighborhoods become after 3 hours of darkness, every collapsed government where neighbor turns on neighbor not over ideology but over bread. These are not anomalies. They are previews. They are the floor of human behavior when the ceiling of consequence is lifted. Hobbes understood that people do not escape the state of nature by becoming moral. They escape it by becoming afraid of returning to it. That fear becomes the engine of the social contract. Not love, not shared values, not collective virtue. Fear of the alternative. Fear dressed up so neatly in the language of civilization that most people mistake the costume for the person wearing it. Now bring this forward into the world you actually live inside. Look at modern society, not as you were taught to see it, but as Hobbes would see it. Watch how silence is enforced, not through moral persuasion, but through social consequence. Watch how conformity is maintained, not through agreement, but through the threat of exclusion. People do not stay in line because they believe in the line. They stay in line because stepping out of it costs something they are not willing to pay: their reputation, their income, their social position, their sense of safety, their access to the group. These are not moral calculations. These are survival calculations dressed in moral language. And that distinction is not minor. That distinction is everything. Because if behavior is driven by fear rather than virtue, then the stability of civilization is not evidence of human goodness. It is evidence of effective pressure management. It is evidence that the system is doing its job. Not the conscience, the system. Watch how quickly moral language appears whenever authority needs compliance. Watch how fast the language of duty and responsibility and community obligation surfaces the moment someone considers stepping outside acceptable behavior. The message is rarely naked fear. It is always dressed in something more flattering: civic duty, social responsibility, the right thing to do. But underneath the language, the threat is always present. Do this, or lose something you cannot afford to lose. That is not morality speaking. That is Hobbes speaking through every institution ever built. Most people live their entire lives without noticing the difference. They perform virtue and believe they are virtuous. They comply under pressure and believe they are choosing freely. They follow rules built on fear and believe they are living by values. Hobbes called this self-deception, not malicious, but structural. The system needs you to believe your compliance is moral. Because people who comply from virtue are easier to manage than people who comply from fear. Virtue never negotiates. Fear always looks for the exit when the cost gets high enough. This is why civilizations do not build moral education systems alone. They build courts. They build prisons. They build public consequences. They make failure visible. They make punishment legible. They make the cost of defection appear in front of every person considering it, not to appeal to conscience, to preempt the calculation. The truly disturbing part of Hobbes is not what he said about the past. It is what he implies about the present. If civilization is maintained through managed fear rather than genuine morality, then the people around you are not moral in the absolute sense. They are obedient in a functional sense, and those two things are not the same. The co-worker who would never steal is not necessarily honest. He may simply have too much to lose. The neighbor who waves and smiles is not necessarily kind. She may simply understand what hostility costs in a functioning community. The person you trust is not necessarily trustworthy in some deep essential way. They may simply exist in a context where betrayal is not yet worth it. This is not cynicism for its own sake. This is the architecture of human behavior that Hobbes spent his life mapping, and the map is accurate enough to be dangerous. Ask yourself the question most people avoid their whole lives. Would the people around you remain moral if the consequences disappeared completely? Would your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors behave with decency if nothing tracked them, nothing punished them, nothing excluded them for failure? Would you? Sit with that question longer than is comfortable. Because the honest answer reveals something Hobbes already knew. Civilization is not a destination humanity reached. It is a pressure humanity maintains. and pressure requires a source. Remove the source and the pressure dissolves. Remove the pressure and the behavior reverts. Not because people are evil, because people are strategic, because the human organism responds to incentives and threats before it responds to abstract moral principle. This is not a pessimistic view of humanity. It is a precise one. Hobbes was not saying humans cannot be good. He was saying that the goodness society observes in people is largely a product of the environment society builds around them. Change the environment. Change the behavior. The person is almost incidental to the equation. That is a cold thought to hold. It is also the most honest thought most people will ever encounter about why the world works the way it does. Order is not natural. Order is constructed. Constructed through systems, through consequences, through the permanent background hum of social pressure that most people feel so constantly they no longer notice it. It is like water to a fish, invisible because it surrounds everything. But remove it, and the fish cannot survive what remains. Hobbes built his entire political philosophy on that recognition. The Leviathan, his name for the sovereign power that makes civilization possible, was not justified by divine right or natural law. It was justified by necessity, by the alternative, by the memory, the fear, the permanent possibility of returning to a world where no one is safe from anyone. And the Leviathan does not need to be a king. It does not need to be a government. It can be a social order, a cultural consensus, a shared agreement that certain costs are always attached to certain behaviors. Any system that makes the state of nature feel more dangerous than submission to authority is functioning as a Leviathan. Every institution you have ever participated in has made that calculation on your behalf, and you accepted the terms, not always consciously, not always willingly, but always because the alternative felt worse. That is what Hobbes wanted people to understand. Civilization is a trade. You give up the unlimited freedom of the state of nature, including the freedom to take whatever you can physically take, and you receive something narrow but precious. Safety, predictability, the ability to wake up tomorrow and still have what you had yesterday. Most people accept that trade without realizing they made it. They grow up inside the terms and never step outside them long enough to see the contract they signed before they could speak. Hobbes saw the contract. He read every clause, and what he reported back was not comfortable, but it was honest. Society does not run on love. It runs on the strategic calculation that cooperation is less dangerous than conflict when the right pressures are applied in the right places at the right time. That is the engine, not goodness, not shared humanity, not the better angels of our nature. Calculated fear, institutionalized, normalized, and dressed in the language of moral civilization until even the people inside the system forget what the system actually runs on. The question was never whether people are moral. The question was always what happens when fear disappears. And somewhere deep in the part of yourself you rarely visit, you already know the answer.